Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty. Today I'm showing you a batch of Easter cards, but here's the catch. I'm going to use three main products for these cards, and I'm going to show you various ways to use these products to stretch your supplies, so you can get lots of ideas to use those specialty products. So let's get started. Here are the three main products I'm going to use. I'm going to use this layering stencil from Pink Fresh Studio. Up on the top there you see a little pot of gold embossing powder, and then I've got this cover plate / background die from the Stamp Market, and I will have links in the show notes below so that you can find all of these products if you like them. But you don't have to use these exact products. In fact, you don't even have to use this stencil. You can use a stamp to do these techniques. And I want to encourage you to stick around for card number 3 because that's got the most interesting technique. Now I am going to start here with my die cutting machine because we are using that background die, and I do have this silicone mat for impressions. Now some machines will come with that mat, but not all of them do. So if you don't have that supply, you could experiment with a piece of craft foam in place of it and see if you can get some results out of that. Otherwise, it's a relatively inexpensive purchase and it really helps stretch your supplies, so I recommend that product. Let's start with card number 1, and I will take a little more time on this card as I explain some of my thought process, and then the next 2 cards will go a little bit faster since you will already know the background. We are going to start off with just die cutting that background plate, and I do use 2 pieces of cardstock as a shim in my plate. Now I've got a black magic mat as my bottom plate, but you don't have to have that. I just like it, and so I use it, but you could just use your regular cutting plates. I run it through my die, and then I've got my background piece. And what I really like to do with these textural pieces is to do tone on tone overlay. So I am just going to add this piece straight on top of my card base. So I've got white on white to give a lot of texture. This particular die has a few delicate edges when you cut them off, so I am going to be sure to put plenty of glue around the edge, and then just a couple squiggle lines through the middle, and that should be enough to hold everything down. So that isn't really all of that complicated, but we'll do something a little bit more fun with that in a minute. I'm going to shift gears to the stenciling here, and now like I said, you don't have to use a stencil. You can use stamp sets for this. Now these layering stencils can be a little bit cheaper than stamps, but sometimes they're about the same cost. However, I think they have a lot more flexibility than a stamp does, so I'm going to show you some of that as we go. Now with layering stencils, you do want to be sure to line up everything the same way each time so that all of your pieces overlay each other correctly. So I make little marks on the corner. I tape my paper down so it can't move, and then I tape my stencil down so it can't move. And then I go ahead and use some kind of blending tool to apply ink in here. Now you can do this with blending brushes. Those tend to be more expensive, so you can use little ink daubers, which sometimes I prefer because they hold more ink, and so you can get richer colors with them. But the drawback of the daubers is that they are foam and they can catch on delicate areas of stencils. You could also use makeup foams from, the grocery store or your local shop, and those will work too. So you don't have to have these specialty products, but I have them and they do have some better properties to them, so I am going to be using them. I've went ahead and put down my second stencil here, and I'm doing my next color in here, and notice what I'm doing with this stencil. I am not using the whole design of this stencil, and so instead of stenciling directly on a card front, which is kind of the basic idea that people go with these stencils, I am going to go ahead and stencil a portion of a pre-cut card front, and then I'm going to create this as a die cut embellishment to my card. So that is one of those techniques that you can do with either stencils or stamps, is just use a portion of it and use that as a cut apart focal element. As we go along here, I'm going to show you each layer of inking because that's one of the things I love about these layering stencils, that you can, I've got 4 colors of ink here. They're ink cubes, so they're small and inexpensive, and you can get a lot of depth and texture with just those supplies. And so I will show you each step as we go. And what's even more fun and useful about stencils is that you can do a light coating of color for a softer effect and a darker coating of color for a darker effect. So you're getting more color range out of that exact same ink pad than you might otherwise get with stamping. Now there are some techniques where you can do something similar with stamping, but I think it's easier to do with stenciling. Now that our stenciling is done, we're going to go ahead and do a very general cutout of this. Now I know a lot of people don't like fussy cutting, but here's a couple tips. If you keep your border wide, that helps any closer or farther away cutting less noticeable. And if you do a little bit of wiggling undulation with your scissors as you go, that makes it look a little more intentional as you move around the shape of the element, and it takes away some of that harshness that regular fussing cutting can have. Now that the focal element is done, we're going to go ahead and turn to our last product, which is the embossing powder. Now, most people will use embossing powder to emboss your greetings, which I will be doing in this also, but I like to use my embossing powders as decorative elements as well. So here I'm going to edge my whole card, and you can just kind of gently swipe your embossing ink around the edge of your card. Now, if you're doing the fold side, make sure you fold your card before you try and catch that edge. And sometimes when you're swiping, you might get a harsh line, but once I powder that image, I can just use my finger to gently swirl away any excess powder, and that will soften edges to give a more random look. I took it off screen, heated it up and set it, and I'm going to set that aside, and we're going to do one more technique with that embossing, and that is to use our stencils to add accents to our focal point. Now you can do this with stamps, but I find it just a little bit easier to do with stencils. So I'm going to mask off areas of the stencil that I don't want to get any of this embossing ink with, and this is where I like to use a dauber because that ink is thicker and the dauber helps pick it up just a little bit better. And then I'm going to go ahead and put my powder in there. And you can see that I made a mistake. My mistake is my ink was still wet and the powder is sticking to the very slight moisture left behind in the ink. So let's fix that. I'm going to clean up my space so that I don't mix up my powder with the sticky contaminated powder. And I'm going to brush off that powder from my image with a tissue paper. And I'm going to discard that powder because it does have some of that sticky ink residue on it, and that can create lumps in your powder later. And then I use my heat tool to dry my ink completely. And then I'm using a powder embossing tool to dust my image completely so that it is nice and dry and that embossing powder can't stick to any stray surfaces. And you can see here how much crisper that embossing ended up on my image once it was heat set. All right, I am going to add a second layer of this embossing to this image because I can. Another one of the stencils has even more detail in there, and I will go ahead and add in a little bit more detail with that embossing powder. In order to clean off the embossing ink from your stencil, I do recommend a little spritz bottle of alcohol by your desk, or take it to your sink and use soap and water because that ink is a different formula. It's not going to clean off as well as regular stamping inks. You may have noticed that I have black markings on my stencil. That is numbers to keep them in order, and it also is corners to help with alignment. Those are done in a permanent Sharpie marker. Alcohol will remove Sharpie, so if you get that alcohol spritz on those markings, it will come off. So I will block those off with my hand, do a very gentle spritz, and then wipe it down with a rag, and that cleans off my stencil so that I can just keep working and I don't have to get up and go to the sink. Here is a little bonus technique for creating my sentiment. I'm just going to swipe some ink across the scrap of paper that I used to die cut, and then I'm going to heat emboss on top of that. Now remember, that ink is still wet, so you do need to dry it and powder it before you do your heat embossing so that you don't get that stray powder everywhere. And I did that the first time. Even though I'm making this video and I knew it, I still forgot. So be sure to get that done ahead of time so your card will come out beautiful in the end. Moving on to card number 2, I kind of wanted to up the Easter theme just a little bit. And so we're going to use stencils on top of shaped die cut. And we're going to change up the way we use that cover plate background die. Let's start with that background die. I have a Sizzix platform here that is a multi-use platform for my cutter. You are going to have to work with your cutter and create your sandwich so that it will be successful with this technique. And because there are so many machines out there, I can't guarantee which sandwich you will need, but look it up for your machine so that you can get the best results. And even if you have a different platform for your Sizzix, you're going to have to look that up as well. So for my machine and my platform, I remove the paper shims, I open up one of the top layer of that multi-purpose platform, I lay my die down face up, put my cardstock on top, put my silicone mat on top of that, and then my final cutting plate on top of that. And once all of that is run through the machine, we have just dry embossed our cardstock instead of die cutting it. And that is another way to get texture and dimension out of your dies without getting the same die cut look over and over again. Now we are going to turn to creating those egg shapes. If you have a die for eggs, that's great, but if you don't, I can show you how to draw them. Yes, you can do this. So I start with sizing my egg, making a tick mark at the top and bottom, and then just below the midway point, a couple of tick marks from side to side. And then I scribble through those tick marks multiple times, and eventually a solid oval shape will emerge. Now I use a permanent pen to trace that solid oval shape, and I don't always get it perfect the first time, and so I will adjust it just a little bit. And then I'm going to cut that out and use that as a template to cut out several egg shapes to use as elements for these cards. Now we are going to use our stencil, the stencil over those eggs. I overlaid the first stencil and the fifth stencil to get a sense of the scale of the entire image before I started stenciling, so that I would make sure it would fit where I wanted it to. And this is a great technique to use on circles, rectangles, squares, triangles, whatever shape, hexagons, whatever shape you can imagine. But since it's Easter, I am doing the egg shape. And with the second egg, I did overlap them how I'm going to do on my card design, and then drew a little bit of a line so that I don't have to stencil the whole egg to save time. And here's where I show you I used a much lighter shading with my ink to get a different variety with that stencil. So just like I edged my card, and you can see off to the left, I went ahead and did that, I'm going to edge my focal images here so that it gives them even more emphasis, pop, and wow. So we've talked about changing up our stencil, changing up our cover die, and then I'm just assembling the card as I did with the previous card. All right, we've arrived at card number 3, which is got the most fun technique. We are going to mix up that cover plate die and our embossing powder to make a stunning focal point that's not based on the stencil. I'm going to use the stencil in the background instead, and I'm actually going to rotate this stencil back and forth to use various portions of the stencil on various parts of the card. So that is another way to stretch your stencils. Don't use the imagery as is. Mix and match parts of the imagery to create what you want. I am going to make sure I protect areas of my card, so as I'm working I don't get stenciling in places that I don't want. And then because I am rotating the stencil as we go, I am going to give you a little bit of a tip on how to make sure your stencils will then line up later. And that is when you lay down your card on your background, you can use a pencil to kind of trace the outline of your card so that the second and third and subsequent stencils, when you line up your card with those markings, you will have a good start to getting the correct placement. And then once you have that first layer of ink, you'll be able to kind of wiggle your card just a little bit to line it up just right until you have the overlapping layers in place. So here is what my background looks like, and you can see I did get a little bit of a smudge of an ink on there, but if you have one of these mono sand erasers, they can easily take care of that smudge. Just gently keep erasing and erasing until that smudge is gone. Okay, now that you've stretched your stencil one more time, we are going to stretch that cover plate die and our embossing powders one more time. So I'm going to set up my mat just like I did for the dry embossing technique with this cover plate. But we're going to add the step of heat embossing to this as well. So I pre-cut my piece of paper here that I'm going to use as my image, and now this gets a little finicky. When you cut it down this size, I would recommend go ahead and doing a larger piece and then cutting out the portion that you want after the fact. However, this is how I did it, so this is what we've got. So I taped a little bit of a handle onto my little piece that I've got there just to make handling this thing a little bit smoother. And I'm going to tape everything down in place. Now you can see behind that die is a sheet of just plain copy paper, and that's going to help protect all the surfaces from the embossing ink that we're going to be using for this technique. Now you can see I was kind of fussing with that piece again, and that's why I say it would be best to go ahead and do a bigger piece and then cut it down after this. But once I've got that taped in place, I'm going to flip it up and then I'm going to ink up my die. Now this is cut surface facing up, and so I'm inking that cut surface. And then I'm going to put another piece of copy paper to protect from the sticky ink, then my silicone mat, and then my top cutting plate. And I'm going to run it through a few times to really get a good impression. We want to really both get the texture impression and the ink transfer onto this piece. And then I'm going to flood it with the embossing powder, and look what you get once it's through. You get a very different look from that cover plate die. And now it's heat set and ready to go. And I did specifically size this piece to fit right in between the flower centers on my background, and that's why I ended up getting so fussy with that piece. So just a quick assembly with this card and it's done. So that's it. Those are multiple ways to use your heat embossing, your cover plate dies, and your background stencils or stamps to create a variety of techniques and looks from this same set of supplies. I hope you got some good tips and tricks out of this video, and if you did, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you're inclined, you could share it with a friend who might get some use out of these tips. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week with new videos.